Silence is not absence. It is a shift of power. The moment you go quiet, something subtle but irreversible happens inside him. The dynamic changes, not because you did anything dramatic, but because you stopped feeding a system that depended on your emotional availability. And this is where exposure begins. Not yours, his. For a long time, your reactions gave him orientation. Your explanations softened his uncertainty. Your questions reassured him that he still mattered, still had access, still influenced your inner world. But when you withdraw your voice, when you stop narrating your feelings, he is left alone with something he carefully avoided, himself. As Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your silence does exactly that. It removes the distractions. It strips away the emotional noise he relied on to stay comfortable. And suddenly, what was once managed becomes visible. He feels exposed because emotional control is rarely about dominance. It's about predictability. When he knew you would respond, clarify, soothe, or reach out, he felt oriented. He could remain distant without consequences. But your silence removes that map. And without it, his internal balance begins to shake. You see, silence is not passive. It is reflective. It becomes a mirror he didn't ask for. In that mirror, he sees the imbalance, the moments where effort was uneven, the places where you carried more than your share. And what unsettles him most is this: he can no longer tell where he stands. In Jung's view, the ego depends on feedback to sustain its illusions. When feedback disappears, the ego panics. That panic is what you feel as his sudden restlessness, his confusion, his subtle attempts to reappear without fully stepping forward. He is not calm in your silence. He is confronted by it. Because when you stop explaining yourself, he loses the ability to frame the story. When you stop reacting, he loses the ability to regulate his sense of importance. And when you stop reaching out, he is left facing the truth that was always there but safely buried. Your presence was never guaranteed. It was chosen. This is why silence feels threatening to him. Not because you are cold, but because you are no longer compensating. And in that space, something ancient awakens. A quiet fear. A question he can't easily answer. What if I no longer have control? And that question lingers, unspoken, heavy, and deeply revealing. What truly unsettles him is not the silence itself, but what silence exposes about his position in your life. When you were expressive, available, emotionally transparent, he could locate himself easily. Even distance felt safe because it happened against a background of your consistency. But now, with your quiet, there is no emotional feedback loop, no confirmation, no reassurance. And in that void, his sense of control begins to dissolve. Control, in this context, was never about authority. It was about emotional gravity. As long as you reacted, he remained the reference point. Your attention orbited him. But when you go quiet, the orbit breaks. The center shifts back to you. And that reversal feels like exposure. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to navigate relationships. Your silence removes the need for his mask to perform. There is no audience now, no immediate response to manage. And without the performance, what remains is raw awareness. He becomes conscious of how much he relied on your emotional presence to avoid confronting his own. This is why he may suddenly feel uneasy, distracted, or compelled to test the connection. A message that says nothing important. A reaction without commitment. These are not confidence-driven acts. They are attempts to re-establish orientation, to see if he still matters in the same way. But silence does something radical. It stops negotiating your value. You are no longer explaining your needs. You are no longer translating your feelings into something digestible. And in Jung's words, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Your quiet is part of that becoming. It signals that your inner world no longer requires validation. And that is deeply destabilizing for someone who unconsciously depended on your openness to feel secure. He feels exposed because he can sense the imbalance more clearly now. He notices how much he took for granted, how little he offered when you were always there. Silence sharpens memory. It reorganizes perspective. And suddenly, he is the one waiting. What you must understand is this: silence does not punish. It reveals. It reveals whether his interest was rooted in connection or in comfort, whether his presence was intentional or convenient, whether he knew how to meet you or only how to be met. And as this realization settles in him, something irreversible begins. He no longer feels in control of the dynamic. He feels accountable to it. And that shift, quiet, invisible, profound, is what makes silence so powerful. Not because it is loud, but because it tells the truth without saying a word. Silence dismantles the illusion he lived inside. When you stop speaking, stop clarifying, stop reaching for emotional alignment, he can no longer hide behind ambiguity. There is nothing to lean on, no reassurance to borrow, no reaction to interpret in his favor. And this is where the exposure deepens, not outwardly, but internally. Because what silence really removes is emotional leverage. As long as you were expressive, he could stay undefined. He could delay decisions, postpone clarity, exist in a comfortable in-between. Your voice kept the connection alive even when his effort did not. But when you go quiet, that suspended state collapses. Something must now take shape, or fall apart. Jung described this moment as confrontation with the shadow. The parts of ourselves we avoid surface when external noise disappears. Your silence becomes the condition that forces this confrontation. He begins to notice the imbalance not as an abstract idea, but as a felt loss. He senses that something essential is no longer accessible. This is why he may feel suddenly smaller, unsure, even subtly anxious. Not because you withdrew affection, but because you withdrew orientation. He no longer knows how to position himself emotionally. And without that position, the ego weakens. Silence also interrupts a familiar pattern, emotional extraction. Before, your presence regulated him. Your attention stabilized him. Your care absorbed his uncertainty. Now, that emotional labor is no longer available. And he feels exposed because he must now carry what he once unconsciously handed to you. This is the moment where his behavior changes, not always visibly, but internally. He replays conversations. He questions past choices. He wonders if he miscalculated. And most importantly, he begins to sense something unsettling. Your inner world no longer revolves around him. That realization is not neutral. It destabilizes. Because when a woman goes quiet, she stops orbiting. She returns to herself. And in that return, she becomes unpredictable, not chaotic, but sovereign. He cannot read you the way he once did. He cannot anticipate your moves. He cannot rely on emotional access as a given. And this is why silence feels like exposure. It removes the comfort of being central without being committed. It demands awareness without offering reassurance. It asks a question he can no longer avoid. Who am I to her now, if she no longer needs me to respond? Silence does not chase an answer. It waits. And in that waiting, the truth begins to surface, slowly, inevitably, without mercy or malice. Just clarity. What he experiences next is not anger, it is disorientation. When silence stretches, the mind tries to regain balance. He may tell himself that nothing has changed, that you're simply busy, that this quiet is temporary. But beneath those thoughts, something more primitive is stirring. A loss of emotional anchoring, a subtle fear of irrelevance. Because control was never about commanding you. It was about knowing where he stood. Your responsiveness gave him emotional coordinates. Your silence removes them. And now he must sit with uncertainty, the very state he once avoided by keeping you engaged. Carl Jung believed that discomfort is the psyche's signal that transformation is near. In that sense, your silence becomes catalytic. It activates a psychological pressure he cannot outsource. There is no conversation to manage, no emotional tone to adjust, only awareness. And awareness feels like exposure. He begins to sense that your quiet is not empty. It is full of self-possession, full of boundaries that no longer announce themselves. This is deeply unsettling because boundaries that speak can be negotiated, but boundaries that exist silently cannot. You are no longer asking to be met. You are observing. And observation removes power from illusion. He may feel the urge to provoke a response, not aggressively, but subtly, a reminder of his presence, a casual question, a half step forward. These are not gestures of confidence. They are attempts to restore emotional symmetry, to see if the old dynamic still breathes. But silence does something unforgiving. It shows him that connection now requires intention. In Jung's view, relationships often collapse when one person individuates faster than the other. Your silence is not withdrawal from him. It is movement toward yourself. And that movement exposes the gap between where you are and where he remained. This is why he feels vulnerable, because he can no longer rely on your openness to bridge that distance. He must cross it himself, or acknowledge that he cannot. Silence does not threaten love. It threatens complacency. And when complacency dissolves, what remains is truth, quiet, steady, and impossible to argue with. There comes a deeper layer of exposure he doesn't expect, and it arrives quietly. When you remain silent long enough, he begins to sense that this is not a tactic. It is not a pause designed to extract reassurance. It is not a waiting room for his return. And that realization shifts something fundamental inside him. Because if your silence is real, then his influence has limits. This is where emotional control truly collapses. Not when you confront him, not when you demand clarity, but when he realizes you are no longer orienting your inner world around his behavior. He can no longer regulate the connection by pulling away or stepping closer. Your center is no longer reactive. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Your silence signals that you are doing exactly that. And when someone witnesses this process from the outside, especially someone who benefited from your earlier self-abandonment, it feels like loss. He feels exposed because he now sees how much he relied on your emotional elasticity. You adapted. You waited. You explained. And in doing so, you made room for his inconsistency. Silence removes that space. There is no cushion anymore. This is when he begins to feel seen without being observed. Seen by the situation. Seen by the consequences. Seen by the absence of your emotional labor. And this kind of exposure has nothing to do with shame. It has to do with responsibility. He may feel an urge to regain ground by redefining the narrative. To tell himself you were too sensitive, too distant, too complex. But even these defenses feel thin now, because silence does not argue back. It simply stands. And standing still while not reaching is profoundly destabilizing. Because your quiet contains a message he cannot ignore, you are no longer negotiating your worth. In this space, he must face a question that can no longer be delayed. Do I step forward consciously, or do I step away permanently? There is no longer a middle ground sustained by your effort. And that is why silence feels like exposure. It does not accuse. It does not demand. It does not chase. It simply reveals where each person truly stands. Silence also removes his ability to test you. Before, he could disappear slightly and watch what happened. Would you reach out? Would you soften the distance? Would you restore emotional closeness for both of you? Each response gave him data. Each reaction reassured him that the bond still functioned on his terms. But now, there is no feedback. And without feedback, his internal authority weakens. This is where the exposure becomes almost physical. He feels it in restlessness, in checking his phone without intention, in moments where your absence suddenly feels louder than your presence ever did. Because silence denies him the one thing that kept him comfortable: confirmation. Carl Jung believed that when an external support disappears, the psyche is forced to reorganize itself. Your silence removes an external support he unconsciously relied on. Not your love, your availability. And without it, his inner structure must either mature or fracture. He may begin to sense something unsettling. You are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing yourself in real time. This is deeply confronting because it shifts the emotional hierarchy. He is no longer the one who decides when closeness happens. He no longer controls the tempo. The connection is no longer suspended in his indecision. And what replaces that suspension is clarity. Silence communicates boundaries without explanation. It signals that access is no longer automatic, that your inner world is no longer open by default. And this forces him to confront a truth he avoided before. Connection requires presence, not convenience. He feels exposed because he cannot hide behind ambiguity anymore. Silence makes patterns visible. It reveals who moved when effort was required, and who stayed still. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your silence does exactly that. It illuminates nothing, but it allows the darkness to surface. And in that darkness, he recognizes something irreversible. You are no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. Not because you closed your heart, but because you reclaimed it. This is the moment when silence stops being interpreted as distance and starts being felt as strength. Quiet, grounded, unprovable strength. And that is why it unsettles him more than words ever could. At some point, he realizes something even more unsettling. Your silence is not waiting for him to change. This is where the last illusion collapses. Before, on some level, he could believe that distance would eventually pull you closer. That confusion would keep you engaged. That time would soften everything without requiring a decision. But silence without pursuit removes that fantasy. It tells him, without cruelty, without explanation, that your life is moving regardless of his hesitation. And this is where exposure turns inward. Because now, the question is no longer, does she still care? The question becomes, why didn't I step forward when I could? Jung described regret as the shadow of unlived life. And your silence places him face to face with unlived choices. He sees the moments where presence was optional and realizes too late that they were defining. This is why silence often triggers delayed emotion. Feelings he postponed now arrive without invitation. Longing appears where certainty once lived. The calm detachment you embody contrasts sharply with the inner turbulence he now carries. He may feel a strange reversal. You seem grounded, while he feels unsteady. Because silence shifts emotional weight. You are no longer holding the tension for two. You are no longer buffering uncertainty. And without your emotional containment, he must experience his own ambiguity fully. That experience is what he feels as exposure. It is not that you became distant. It is that he lost the shelter your presence provided. And here is the most important truth of all. Silence does not force him to act. It simply removes the illusion that he doesn't have to. In Jung's view, growth begins where avoidance ends. Your silence is the end of avoidance. It leaves him standing at the threshold of awareness, free to step forward or free to turn away, but no longer free to remain unchanged. That is why silence feels final even when nothing has ended. Because something has ended. The version of the connection that survived on your effort alone. And once that ends, only truth remains. What follows silence is not emptiness, it is reckoning. At this stage, he begins to understand that your quiet is not a message meant for him at all. It is an internal alignment. And this realization removes his last defense, the belief that everything still revolves around his response. Because now, even if he speaks, he cannot be sure you will return in the same way. This is where exposure becomes existential. He is no longer reacting to your absence. He is confronting his own position in your life. Not imagined, not assumed, real. And reality, unlike emotion, does not negotiate. Jung believed that relationships fail not from lack of love, but from lack of consciousness. Your silence increases consciousness. It sharpens perception. It reveals what was sustained by habit rather than intention. And he feels that clarity is pressure, because now, effort has weight. Words have consequences. Timing matters. The emotional field is no longer forgiving by default. And for someone who relied on flexibility without reciprocity, this shift feels dangerous. He may begin to sense something quietly terrifying. You are no longer accessible through confusion. Silence has made you emotionally opaque, not closed, but self-contained. He cannot read your longing anymore. He cannot rely on your empathy to soften his hesitation. And that forces him to face a truth Jung often emphasized. What is not faced consciously returns as fate. If he does nothing now, something will still happen without him. This is why silence feels like losing control. Because control was never about power over you. It was about delaying choice. And silence ends delay. You are not asking for answers. You are living as if your life already has one. And that is the most exposing position of all. Because it shows him that connection was never guaranteed by time, history, or emotion, but by presence. And presence requires courage. Something silence quietly demands, without ever insisting. In this space, he is left with himself. And for the first time, he knows it. At this point, silence becomes irreversible, not because you intend it to be, but because you have changed inside it. He begins to sense that even if you returned, it would not be from need. And that is what finally removes his emotional leverage. Because leverage only exists where there is dependency, and your quiet has dissolved that dependency without announcement. This is where exposure reaches its deepest level. He understands now that he cannot re-enter the dynamic the same way. He cannot rely on familiarity. He cannot assume emotional access. He cannot step in halfway and expect the old connection to reassemble itself around him. Something essential has shifted, and he feels it intuitively. Jung spoke of psychological thresholds, points beyond which the psyche cannot return unchanged. Silence is one of those thresholds. It alters identity. It reorganizes value. And once crossed, it makes certain patterns impossible to repeat. He feels exposed because he is now visible to himself. He sees how much he delayed, how much he assumed, how often he relied on your patience to protect him from consequence. And this awareness is heavy because it comes without accusation. There is no argument to defend against, no emotion to manage, only recognition. And recognition demands responsibility. You are no longer reacting to his movements. You are no longer calibrating your emotional state around his presence or absence. Your nervous system has settled into itself. And when a woman reaches this state, the entire emotional dynamic reorganizes around her. Silence has not made you distant. It has made you anchored. And an anchored woman cannot be controlled emotionally, not because she resists, but because she no longer needs to be oriented by someone else's behavior. This is why he feels the pressure now. Because if he approaches, he must do so consciously, fully, without games, without ambiguity. And that level of presence requires something he may not yet possess. Silence has removed his ability to stay undefined. And in that removal, it has shown him exactly where he stands, not in your words, but in your life. What silence ultimately does is return everything to its rightful owner. You are no longer carrying the emotional tension of the connection. You are no longer stabilizing what he avoided stabilizing himself. You are no longer translating your depth into something smaller, so it feels safe for him. And in that release, something profound settles inside you. Peace. Not the kind that comes from answers, but the kind that comes from alignment. He feels exposed now because nothing is being held together for him anymore. No emotional scaffolding. No quiet reassurance beneath the surface. No guarantee that you will remain reachable simply because you once were. And this exposure is not punishment. It is consequence. As Jung observed, growth begins when the psyche is deprived of its usual defenses. Your silence removes the last defense, unconscious dependence on your presence. And whether he rises to meet this reality or retreats from it, is no longer your responsibility. Because your silence is not a strategy. It is a return to your own rhythm, a return to self-trust, a return to an inner authority that does not announce itself. And this is why silence is so powerful. It does not chase transformation. It creates the conditions for truth. It reveals who can meet you where you stand, and who only knew how to stand where you bent. If he steps forward now, it must be with awareness. If he does not, your life still moves, cleanly, calmly, without rupture. Silence does not close doors. It simply removes the illusion that they were always open. And in that clarity, you don't lose connection. You regain yourself.